The galaxy categorized Earth as a biological quarantine zone. They looked at our crushing gravity, our volatile atmosphere, our endless history of self-destruction, and locked the door. They thought we were a tragic evolutionary mistake. Then the Vect swarm nearly consumed the stars, and the galaxy finally unlocked our cage. Tyle wiped a streak of pale blue fluid from his cheek. It was his own blood. The command bunker of Talos Prime shook violently, raining pulverized concrete and fine grey dust onto the flickering tactical holotable. The sky above the colony wasn't supposed to burn. The Oscari had designed Talos Prime to be a jewel of agriculture and philosophy, shielded by an automated defense grid that had stood undefeated for 3 centuries. The Vect didn't care about Oscari philosophy. Tyle leaned his weight against the console, his hollow bones aching from the constant micro-tremors of orbital bombardment. He watched the red indicators on the screen. The Vect swarm was chewing through the last of the defense drones. They were a biological anomaly, a hive-mind species of vacuum-hardened carapace, acid-spitting biocannons, and razor-sharp mandibles that consumed entire biospheres. The Oscari were scholars and architects. They fought wars mathematically, using elegant repulsor drones and highly calibrated plasma lancers. If the math said they would lose, they surrendered. The Vect didn't take prisoners. They took calories. "Commander," spoke a trembling voice. It was Kalen, a junior sensor technician, barely out of his primary molting phase. He was gripping his console so hard his 4 digits were turning white. "Orbital Tether 3 has collapsed. The swarm is entering the upper atmosphere. Estimated time until surface impact is 4 minutes. Tyle closed his large black eyes. "Send the final broadcast. Tell the core worlds that Talos Prime has fallen. Purge the databanks. Commander." "Wait." Kalen's hands flew across his console. The holographic display glitched, painting a splash of deep green at the edge of the system's gravity well. "Hyperspace rupture. Someone just jumped in." Tyle frowned. "The evacuation fleet? They're weeks away." "No." Kalen swallowed hard. "It's not Oscari architecture. The mass readings are... they're absurd. It's too heavy to achieve traditional orbit. It's entirely solid." Tyle limped over to the sensor station and pulled up the optical feed. The ship that drifted out of the dark was a brutalist nightmare. It lacked the sweeping, aerodynamic curves of Oscari vessels. It was an angular, scarred brick of dark grey metal, bristling with jagged antennae and blocky weapon housings. It looked like a mining implement that had been crudely repurposed for murder. Along its scarred flank, white-painted letters read, "UNS Dreadnought." "Who are they?" Kalen whispered. "The distress beacon was set to omnidirectional," Tyle said, his voice flat. "It translates to any listening post, even the quarantined sectors." "The Death Worlders," Kalen's breath hitched. "Earth?" Before Tyle could answer, the human ship opened fire. There was no build-up of elegant plasma energy, no glowing beams of hard light. Tyle watched the telemetry in absolute bafflement. The human ship was firing solid matter. Massive magnetic coils along the ship's spine flashed, accelerating dense slugs of tungsten to relativistic speeds. In the vacuum of space, it was silent. On the tactical screen, it was devastation. A tungsten slug the size of a habitation module slammed into a Vect biocruiser. The kinetic transfer was so absolute, so violent, that the heavily armored alien vessel didn't just break apart. It liquefied. The sheer friction of the impact flashed the ship's internal fluids into steam, causing the Vect vessel to pop like a rotten fruit in a pressure chamber. "By the ancestors," Tyle muttered. "They're throwing rocks." "They're throwing rocks at a fraction of the speed of light," Kalen corrected, staring at the screen. The human dreadnought didn't stop. It waded into the thick of the swarm, taking grazing hits from acid spitters that merely scorched its incredibly dense armor plating. It was a brawler stepping into a room full of fencers. The humans didn't care about shields. They relied on thick, cold steel and the terrifying physics of mass times acceleration. "Commander." Kalen's voice rose an octave. "The human ship is launching secondary craft. Atmospheric insertion trajectories." Tyle looked at the projected descent paths. "Those aren't repulsor craft. The descent angle is too steep. They're going to burn up. Are their navigation arrays malfunctioning?" "No," Kalen said, his screen flashing with dozens of tiny plummeting dots. "They aren't trying to glide, they're just dropping. For a species accustomed to the gentle, gravity-assisted descent of atmospheric shuttles, the arrival of the Terran reinforcements looked indistinguishable from an orbital strike." Tyle dragged himself out of the bunker and into the trench network surrounding the compound. The sky screamed. It was a physical, tearing sound that vibrated in Tyle's teeth. Dozens of charred, metallic teardrops plummeted through the smoke-filled clouds. They didn't slow down until the very last second, firing brutal retro rockets that kicked up localized sandstorms before they slammed into the dirt. The impact shook the ground hard enough to knock Tyle off his feet. He crawled to the edge of the trench and peered over the reinforced plasteel barricade. 30 yards away, one of the drop pods sat smoking in a fresh crater. It was scorched black, radiating a blistering heat. With a pressurized hiss, the explosive bolts on the pod's heavy doors blew outward. The heavy metal ramp slammed into the mud. Heavy boots stepped out. Tyle pulled a biometric scanner from his belt and aimed it at the emerging figures. He wanted to understand what kind of biology could survive that landing. The readings that came back made his secondary heart skip a beat. The humans were bipeds, entirely encased in scratched olive-drab armor. They carried blocky, heavy kinetic rifles. But it was their internal chemistry that terrified Tyle. The scanner warned of toxic levels of epinephrine and cortisol flooding their systems. Their heart rates were elevated to a point that would cause a myocardial rupture in an Oscari. "They're poisoning themselves," Tyle whispered to himself. One of the humans, wearing a helmet marked with 2 white bars, noticed Tyle in the trench. The human jogged over. The sheer density of the creature's footfalls in the mud spoke to a bone structure that evolved under crushing gravity. The human stopped at the edge of the trench, staring down at Tyle. The helmet's faceplate slid back with a soft, mechanical click. Captain Stephen Hayes looked exhausted. His face was smeared with grease, his skin a pale, fleshy tone that seemed entirely too soft for a creature of war. He looked down at the delicate, grey-skinned alien bleeding in the trench. "You the guy in charge?" Hayes asked. His voice was deep, scraping out through a universal translator clamped to his collar. "I am Commander Tyle," he replied, struggling to stand. You shouldn't be here. Your biology is currently undergoing a catastrophic stress response. My scanner shows your internal organs are flooding with a highly volatile stimulant." Hayes let out a short, rough bark of laughter. "That's just adrenaline, Commander. Means we're awake." He racked the bolt of his rifle. It made a heavy metallic clack. "Where's the front line?" "There is no line," Tyle said bitterly. "They are coming from the tree line. Thousands of them. Our plasma turrets overheated an hour ago. You cannot hold them. We need to fall back." "Can't fall back," Hayes said, chewing on a piece of compressed synthetic gum. "Drop pods don't go up, only down." Before Tyle could explain the suicidal nature of their situation, a shrieking chitter echoed from the smoking ruins of the forest. The Vect were here. They poured out of the trees like a living, oily river. 6-limbed monstrosities the size of ground cars, armored in chitinous plates that deflected standard energy weapons. Their scythe-like forelegs chewed through the mud, propelling them forward at terrifying speeds. Tyle braced for the end. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't issue a complex mathematical firing solution. He just raised his voice. "First platoon, fix bayonets. Check your lanes. Let 'em get close." The humans lined the crater edges and trench lines. They didn't fire immediately. They just waited. Tyle watched his scanner. The humans' heart rates spiked again, but their hands didn't shake. Their internal chemistry was weaponizing their fear, turning biological panic into razor-sharp focus. They were apex predators, perfectly adapted to the geometry of violence. "Light 'em up," Hayes barked. The noise was deafening. Human weapons didn't hum or zap. They banged. The air filled with the sharp, concussive cracks of expanding gunpowder and supersonic lead. The front rank of the Vect swarm disintegrated. Tungsten core rounds shattered chitin and pulped alien organs. The kinetic force of the human rifles was so immense that it flipped the charging Vect backwards, disrupting the charge of the creatures behind them. Yellow ichor sprayed across the mud, but there were too many. A Vect warrior vaulted the leading barricade, its scythe coming down toward a human soldier named Miller. Tyle watched in horror, expecting the fragile, flesh-and-blood human to be cleaved in too. Instead, Miller stepped inside the arc of the blade. He didn't try to block it. His species' instincts knew they couldn't match the alien's mass. Instead, Miller slammed the stock of his rifle into the joint of the Vect's foreleg, shattering the fragile hinge. As the alien shrieked and collapsed, Miller drew a serrated combat knife from his chest rig and drove it precisely into the gap between the creature's neck plates. He twisted the blade, kicked the twitching corpse off his boots, and went back to firing his rifle. It took less than 3 seconds. Tyle felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The Oscari had built weapons to fight the Vect. Earth had built humans to fight. Hayes took a glancing hit from a bioacid spit. The corrosive liquid hissed against his shoulder armor, eating through the plating and searing the flesh beneath. Tyle gasped. Hayes grunted, stepping back. He didn't drop his weapon. He didn't scream for medical evacuation. He reached up, detached the melting armor plate with a violent yank, and tossed it into the mud. Beneath it, his uniform was soaked in thick, dark red blood. "You're leaking vital fluids," Tyle yelled over the gunfire. "Your structural integrity is compromised." "It's a flesh wound," Hayes growled, pulling a small plastic auto-injector from his belt and jamming it into his thigh. "Keep your head down, Commander. We're just getting started." The battle raged. Mud turned to a slurry of dirt, yellow alien ichor, and red human blood. The humans didn't fight with elegance. They fought with a desperate, grinding brutality. When their rifles clicked empty, they used sidearms. When the sidearms ran dry, they used entrenching tools, knives, and their own armored fists. Tyle realized the terrifying truth about the species the galaxy had locked away. The humans weren't just surviving the war. They were in their natural habitat. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple as the local star dipped below the horizon. But the battlefield remained violently illuminated. Muzzle flashes strobed in the gathering dark like a localized thunderstorm. Tracer rounds painted harsh, unbroken lines of red light through the smoke, connecting the human trenches to the endless, shifting mass of the Vect swarm. Tyle huddled against the reinforced concrete wall of the command bunker's shattered entrance. His tactical interface was dead. The Oscari orbital network was gone. He was reduced to experiencing war through his organic senses, and it was overwhelming. The smell was the worst part. It was a suffocating mixture of scorched alien chitin, raw ozone, copper blood, and the acrid, sulphurous stench of human gunpowder. 10 feet away, a human medic named Granger was working on a soldier. The soldier, a young private named Donovan, had taken a glancing strike from a Vect scythe. His armor had held against the edge, but the sheer blunt force had crushed his left leg below the knee. In Oscari military doctrine, a soldier with a compromised mobility apparatus and catastrophic vascular damage was mathematically dead. The protocol was a painless chemical injection to preserve resources and maintain unit cohesion. Granger was not following protocol. The medic was covered in a slurry of mud and his comrade's blood. He didn't offer Donovan a painless death. Instead, he inflicted more pain. Granger twisted a thick nylon strap, a tourniquet, high around Donovan's thigh, cranking a metal rod down with brutal force. Donovan screamed, a raw, ragged sound that tore at Tyle's auditory receptors. "Shut up, kid. You're fine," Granger grunted, his voice devoid of panic, but heavy with exhaustion. He ripped open a plastic packet with his teeth, pulling out a handful of white gauze, and aggressively packed it directly into the open wound. "He is entering hypovolemic shock," Tyle warned, unable to look away from the barbaric medical procedure. "His probability of survival is less than 14%. You are wasting critical combat time." Granger didn't even look up. "Never tell me the odds, Grey Boy." He jammed an auto-injector into Donovan's neck. "Hey, Donnie, look at me." Donovan's eyes were rolling back, his skin the color of old ash. "Doc, it's cold." "Yeah, well, suck it up. We're on a dirt ball in the middle of nowhere. It's supposed to be cold." Granger slapped the kid's face, hard. "You stay awake. You owe me $20 from last night's poker game. You die. I'm telling your mother you welched on a bet." Donovan let out a wet, rattling laugh. Screw you, Doc. That's it. Stay mad," Granger said, slapping a dressing over the packed wound. He stood up, grabbed his rifle, and turned back to the firing line. He left Donovan bleeding in the mud, but the boy's eyes were open. He was gripping his sidearm, watching the trench line. Tyle felt a profound, chilling realization wash over him. The humans weaponized everything. They weaponized fear with adrenaline. They weaponized spite. They kept their wounded alive not out of cold logic, but out of a fierce, irrational pack bonding that defied all mathematical probability. An Oscari fought until the math said they couldn't. A human fought until they were physically rendered down to component atoms. A heavy impact shook the ground, rattling the teeth in Tail's skull. This wasn't the rhythmic pounding of orbital artillery. It was a localized tremor. Footsteps. "Heavy contact," yelled a soldier down the trench, his voice cracking over the roar of gunfire. "Sector 4, we got a big one." Tyle dragged himself up to the viewport. Through the swirling smoke and rain, a silhouette emerged. It was a Vect siege breaker. Toll had only seen holographic renderings of them in the Core World archives. It was a monstrosity of biological engineering, standing 4 stories tall and heavily armored in overlapping plates of dark, iridescent carapace. It didn't have scythes. It had massive, blunt forelimbs designed to crush heavy fortifications. Its jaw was distended, dripping a volatile biological plasma that glowed with a sickening green light. "Concentrate fire!" Captain Hayes bellowed. He was leaning against a mud-slicked barricade, his left arm hanging limp, his rifle resting on a sandbag. The human line shifted its focus. Hundreds of kinetic rounds slammed into the siege breaker. Sparks flew into the night air as tungsten cores sparked against the thick alien armor. The beast flinched, its forward momentum slowing, but it didn't stop. The armor was simply too thick. The rounds that did penetrate only buried themselves in layers of dense, fibrous tissue that didn't seem to contain any vital organs. The siegebreaker opened its maw and convulsed. A torrent of glowing green plasma vomited outward, splashing across the trench line 30 yards to Tail's left. The scream of melting plasteel was instantly drowned out by the screams of burning men. 3 human soldiers were caught in the blast. The acid ate through their armor in seconds, chewing into flesh and bone. Tyle watched in horror as one of them, fully engulfed in green fire, didn't fall to the ground. Instead, the burning human pulled the pin on a fragmentation grenade and threw himself over the barricade, sprinting directly into the mass of smaller Vect swarming the beast's legs. The detonation ripped 3 of the smaller aliens apart, the human's final act a calculated exchange of his own ruined life for a tactical advantage. Tyle was shaking. It was madness. It was glorious, terrifying madness. The siegebreaker lumbered forward, closing the distance to the main command bunker. Beneath this bunker lay the subterranean shelters housing over 40,000 Oscary civilians. The automated bulkheads were rated for standard plasma fire, not the crushing mass of a siege breaker. If it breached the doors, the swarm would pour down into the tunnels. It would be a slaughter. "Anti-armor!" Hayes roared, spitting a mouthful of blood into the mud. "Where the hell is my heavy ordnance?" A massive human named Carver slid into the mud next to Hayes, lugging a thick, olive-drab tube over his shoulder. "Right here, Cap, but the thermal optics are fried. Mud in the casing." "I don't care," Hayes snapped. "Dumbfire it. Put it in its eye." Carver hoisted the weapon. He didn't take time to calculate windage or atmospheric density. He leveled the tube, held his breath, and pulled the trigger. The backblast kicked up a massive cloud of water and dirt. A shaped charge rocket screamed across the battlefield, leaving a trail of white smoke. It slammed into the siegebreaker's chest plate. The explosion was deafening. A blossom of orange fire illuminated the rain-slicked battlefield. For a moment, the trench cheered. Then the smoke cleared. The rocket had shattered a massive section of the creature's outer carapace, exposing weeping, yellow flesh underneath. But it hadn't hit anything vital. The beast let out a sound like grinding metal and locked its multiple eyes on Carver's position. "Son of a bitch," Carver whispered. The siegebreaker lowered its massive head and charged. The ground heaved. The sheer kinetic energy of the charging beast sent shock waves through the mud, collapsing sections of the trench line. Humans scrambled, firing their weapons into the exposed wound on the beast's chest. But it was like shooting a mountain. Hayes grabbed Tyle by the collar of his uniform and dragged him backward, away from the barricade, just as the siegebreaker's massive forelimb slammed into the concrete. The reinforced plasteel shattered like glass. Rebar snapped with a sound like pistol fire. Carver, trapped beneath the collapsing concrete, didn't scream. He simply drew his sidearm and emptied the magazine into the beast's face before thousands of pounds of rubble crushed him. The beast tore away the remaining debris, exposing the heavy blast doors that led down into the civilian shelters. It reared back, its maw glowing green as it prepared to melt the locks. Tyle felt a profound emptiness. The math was final. They were out of heavy weapons. They were out of time. He closed his eyes, preparing for the end. "O'Connor!" Hayes's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. "Get the dreadnought on the horn, now!" The radio operator, huddled behind a shattered support pillar, desperately toggled his frequency dials. "I have them, Captain, but they're engaged with 2 bio-cruisers in low orbit. Tell them to drop a kinetic rod on my beacon," Hayes yelled. Tyle's eyes snapped open. He grabbed Hayes's arm, his delicate grey fingers slipping on the human's blood-slicked armor. "Captain, you cannot call for an orbital strike on this position. The blast radius of a kinetic rod will annihilate this entire grid square. You will kill us all." Hayes looked down at the alien. His face was a mask of dirt, grease, and grim determination. "The blast doors below us are rated for a direct nuclear impact. The civilians will survive the shockwave." "But we are on the surface!" Tyle screamed, the universal translator struggling to convey his sheer panic. "We are entirely exposed. It is suicide." "It's not suicide, Commander," Hayes said quietly, reaching up and tapping a command on his helmet's comms unit. "It's a trade." Hayes stood up. He didn't take cover. He climbed onto the shattered remains of the concrete barricade, completely exposing himself to the swarm. He raised his left arm, tapping a red beacon strapped to his wrist. A piercing, high-frequency laser shot straight up into the clouds, painting a target directly in front of the bunker doors, directly onto the siege breaker. "UNS Dreadnought, this is Captain Hayes. Danger close. Grid coordinates 00-0. Fire for effect." A voice crackled over the radio, heavy with static. "Copy that, Captain. Rod is away. Godspeed." "Get down!" Hayes roared, diving backward off the rubble and tackling Tyle into a deep crater filled with freezing mud. "Cover your ears and open your mouth." Tyle didn't understand the command, but he obeyed the violent shove. For 3 seconds, the battlefield went eerily silent. The gunfire seemed to fade. Even the roaring of the Vect swarm felt distant. There was only the sound of the rain. Then, the sky tore open. It wasn't a bomb. It was a solid pillar of tungsten, 20 feet long, dropped from low orbit. It didn't explode. It delivered pure kinetic energy. When it struck the siege breaker, the laws of physics asserted their absolute dominance. The impact flashed the surrounding air into plasma. The sound didn't register as a noise. It was a physical blow that knocked the breath from Tail's lungs and ruptured his eardrums. The ground liquefied. A shockwave of dirt, crushed chitin, and superheated steam rolled over the crater. Tail was buried under a foot of heavy, wet earth. He couldn't breathe. His vision went entirely black. He thought, for a fleeting moment, that he had finally become part of the math. Hands grabbed him. Rough, heavy hands dug into the dirt, hauling him upward. Tail gasped, spitting mud and grey blood. He opened his eyes. The world was grey. The rain was turning the suspended dust into a thick, gritty fog. The trench line was completely gone, replaced by a massive, perfectly smooth crater of glassed sand and compacted earth. The siege breaker was gone. Not dead. Simply erased. The sheer concussive force of the strike had obliterated the vanguard of the Vect swarm. The remaining aliens, lacking the higher brain functions to process the absolute devastation, were retreating. Their hive mind had registered the massive loss of biomass and calculated that the caloric expenditure was no longer viable. They were falling back to the tree line. Tael lay in the mud, staring at the sky. Beside him, Captain Hayes was sitting up. The human's armor was warped and cracked. The visor of his helmet was shattered. Blood was leaking from his nose and ears, dripping steadily down his chin. Hayes didn't look triumphant. He didn't cheer. He simply reached into a pouch on his chest rig with trembling, mud-caked fingers. He pulled out a crushed, damp paper cylinder, placed it between his lips, and struck a chemical match. He inhaled deeply, the tip of the cigarette glowing a dull orange in the grey gloom. Around them, the surviving humans began to crawl out of the dirt. They were broken, bleeding, missing limbs and armor plates. But they didn't collapse. Granger was already moving, dragging his medical kit through the sludge, shouting for survivors. 2 soldiers were attempting to dig Carver out of the rubble, their bare hands bleeding as they hauled away concrete. Tyle slowly pushed himself up. He looked at Hayes, then at the heavy blast doors of the shelter. The doors were buckled and scorched, but they held. The 40,000 Oscari beneath them were safe. "Why?" Tyle asked, his voice barely a whisper through his damaged translator. "Your species is quarantined. The galaxy rejected you. We looked at your history, at your brutality, and we locked you in the dark. Why would you bleed for us?" Hayes exhaled a long plume of blue smoke, watching it mix with the rain. He looked at the crater, at the bodies of his men half buried in the mud. You locked us away because you thought we were monsters, Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of the adrenaline that had fueled him moments before. You looked at our wars, our weapons, our history. You saw how good we were at killing. And you were right. We are built for war, Commander. Hayes turned his head, his pale blue eyes locking onto Tail. There was no hatred in them, only a profound, exhausting sorrow. But you missed the point, Hayes continued quietly. We don't fight because we like it. We fight because we know exactly what happens when the line breaks. We fight so you don't have to. Hayes offered Tyel a heavy, scarred hand. Tyel looked at the hand. It was the hand of an apex predator, a creature of violence, forged in gravity and stress, capable of unimaginable brutality, but it was extended in peace. Tyel reached out and took it. The galaxy had been wrong. They hadn't locked away a plague. They had locked away their only shield. And now, as the humans dragged themselves through the mud to patch the Oscary defenses, Tyel knew the Vect wouldn't consume the stars. The predators of Earth had been let off the leash, and they were angry. If you felt the sheer grit of Captain Hayes and his men holding the line against impossible odds, smash that like button. Humans aren't just survivors. We are the shield the galaxy didn't know it needed. What did you think of the Dreadnought's orbital strike? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY tales where humanity proves we own the battlefield.